Hello and welcome to the Sustainability Experts, a podcast that brings you practical advice on sustainable business. I'm your host, Vanessa Thompson, and in this episode, we're featuring the esteemed filmmaker Jennifer Stolo. Stolo is the CEO and producer of Robert Craig Films, where she leverages her extensive background in nonprofit leadership to produce films that inspire social change. Her career includes serving as president and CEO of the Make-A-Wish Northeastern Central California and Northern Nevada regions, and leading roles at various organizations dedicated to supporting children and their families in crisis. Jennifer, thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, Vanessa. This is great.
Well, I know I introduced you, but I would love if you could share your story as well too and introduce yourself in terms of how you got into this line of work.
Yeah, well, I think many things happen for, reasons, and many things just happen because they happen, right? So, gosh, I've been in my career about 30 years. Of course, I started when I was 15. uh, but I think, I was raised in a background where my mom was a nurse, a pediatric nurse, actually at Stanford Hospital, working with children with cancer, and really was involved in many nonprofits, really about philanthropy and giving back. And so certainly got a lot of that from her. And then my father was a businessman. And so I think it kind of brought both worlds together for me.
Hmm.
So as I ventured out from college, I began my career looking where I could make a difference. But I could also be a strong businesswoman as well, too. And so I spent my first 10 years actually overseeing child development centers and kind of fell in love with the little people, as I called them. That began my passion for children and advocating for children in all different ways. I journeyed from there over to Boys Town, Father Flanagan's Boys Town out of Omaha, Nebraska. Had a wonderful chapter in California. And so, as a vice president, I led efforts there around fundraising and advocacy. Their children that are in foster care, and really, you know, began to learn so much around, that social change that around children and what they had endured. And it was a really inspiring way to venture into this new line of work, but also heartbreaking, in so many ways. And I think it kept me on that journey to really become, involved in nonprofits. How can we make a difference as leaders? From that, I ventured up to CDA, which is the California Dental Association up in Sacramento. That's what brought me here locally many years ago to do a statewide campaign for access to care around individuals that just really just didn't have any kind of access to dental care. And what I learned so much from that is that when you don't have teeth that you're proud of, you don't smile, and it creates this
Yeah.
whole different feel, right, about self-worth and who you are, and especially in children and young adults. And so that was a really wonderful experience for 5 years to be able to lead a successful campaign that brought
Mm.
about access to care for so many individuals here in California. And then I got a tap on the shoulder to come over to something that is still near and dear to my heart, which is president and CEO of Make-A-Wish. I think the wonderful journey through that, as I mentioned, my mom was pediatric nurse out in Stanford, which is out in the Bay Area, San Francisco Bay Area.
Mhm.
And what happened is it was her last year before she retired. And so we were able to share that first year as I was CEO, and her last year before she retired, where her
Wow.
patients were my wish kids. And
I
that
love
was
it.
just a beautiful journey that we got to experience together. And so I was there for a decade, 10 years at Make-A-Wish. And then, again, accidentally kind of found my way into Robert Craig Films, which we can talk
Yeah.
a little bit more about. But it's been a wonderful journey that has led me to, I think, be that purpose-driven leader, but leading with grace and compassion because of the causes that I've been so fortunate to be able to be an advocate for, and to be able to share with our communities and the world.
Yeah, that's so beautiful. Thank you for sharing that journey with us. And I think you kind of touched on kind of maybe what inspired you initially to get into these films, but I also kind of wanted to ask you as well too, as to why did homelessness speak to you so much? I mean, your recent film that, has now just gone on streaming, as you mentioned, which is wonderful. It's really featuring around humanizing this crisis, right? Really showing the stories of individuals who are just like us, but got a few strokes of bad luck and ended up on the street. And so really showing that these are real people. I know that you interviewed many people who are on the street and doing this work for this film. But was there a particular moment for you that kind of changed your perspective on this or made you realize that this is the specific social inequality that I want to feature in this film?
Yeah, I think it's twofold. I'll take you back about 8 years ago to a story that changed the way I think I looked at this situation. I think we all can say we were at one point, or may still be, that we pull up to a street corner and we look at someone and we think, get a job. You made poor decisions,
Mhm.
right? That's the attitude, unfortunately, of much of the folks in our community. And my perception of all of this changed about 8 years ago. My husband and I were driving down a road called Watt Avenue here that takes you from Placer County area into Sacramento. And we pulled up to a stoplight and we looked to the right of us, and there was a gentleman laid flat on the sidewalk, appeared to be not breathing, just completely out. And there was a moment where my husband and I both looked at each other. He's also been a nonprofit, been a purpose-driven leader, for many, many years. And I think we both, in that moment, just as humans, thought, "Oh my gosh, we have to do something." And
Mhm.
we both thought it at the same time. We pulled over. We got out of the car. My husband went over to him, and I thought for sure I was about to perform CPR. And he reached down to the man, put his hand out, and this gentleman looked up at my husband with the saddest eyes ever I remember, and he says, "I've really messed up my life." And my husband
Mhm.
pulled him up. We were over by Jimbo's Tacos. I remember that. We sat down, we got him something to eat, and we had a conversation. And that was the first time that I had, and my husband actually, had ever had a conversation with someone experiencing homelessness. And it was that
Mm.
moment where you learn about someone's backstory, and their journey that led them to that moment in time where they were laying flat on a sidewalk. And yes, one can judge that, we made bad decisions. If that's what got us here in the first place. But we've all made bad decisions. We've all become a little lost from time to time, right?
Yeah.
Maybe most of us had a support system that helped us get through that, and others may not have had that. And that was his story of how he got
Yeah.
to that point in time. And I remember leaving there thinking, there was so much of judgment that I think I had every time I went up to a street corner.
Mm.
And it changed the way I looked at people and individuals. I
Yeah.
began then to actually pull up to a street corner and hand out money, hand out food.
Mm.
So fast forward, here I am now knowing that's actually not the best thing to do. From that point, interestingly enough, life has so many different journeys that it takes you on. My husband
Mm.
actually took a position as CEO of a homeless service program about
Mhm.
6 months after that happened to us. That led me and my family, we have 6 children, too many, to journey down a path of volunteering. My children always volunteered in whatever cause we were supporting in our jobs or our communities, but
Mhm.
we intimately became involved by going to shelters, serving food, having conversations, working in all different ways. And it really changed the way we all looked, at this scenario. And who would have thought? Here I am, 2.5 years ago, a script comes across, our table. And to your follow-up question, it really, I think, spurred so much in all of us as producers. We all had an intimate connection. I had the connection of working with my husband and volunteering, and really knowing and understanding, how this situation could come about for anyone. Because, like you said, it really could happen to anyone.
Yeah.
52% of Americans across this country are living paycheck to paycheck. I mean, it can happen to
Yeah.
anyone, right? And so
Mhm.
we were actually in the middle of filming another movie called Amy and Angel. And when this script came forward, everyone looked at it and said, you know what? This is such a pressing issue in our country right now. And it is such an issue that people can look at it in all different ways. They can look at it in a political way. They can look at it in a way of judgment. They can look at it in a compassionate way. And the screenplay really allowed us to position it in this way that we could humanize the situation, that we could bring about more empathy and compassion around this situation, and hopefully open up the hearts and minds, of Americans and inspire change. And it was just a film
Yeah.
at first, which I know we'll talk more, but it led into what I call, a movement. So it's the no address movement that we found
Mm.
ourselves on this journey that we could talk a little bit more about. But that was kind of, my journey of how I got to this place, and just love, that I'm able to really help inspire people to look at individuals in a different way, and stop the NIMBYism that not in my backyard, because these are our neighbors.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love that story that you shared of making that really personal. And I think that stories are such a great way for us to, develop empathy and kind of grow that within ourselves because I think that that's sometimes hard. We're kind of focused on, what we have to do the next day. And I wanted to really ask you about, when you're doing impact work, you have to kind of develop this sense of empathy in your audiences and the people that you work with who may otherwise just maybe be distracted or maybe not be thinking in the way that you are. In regards to this, when we think about, even looking at children's books and how they've inspired people to have more empathy for animals. I know in the 1980s that they started to have animals as the main characters in stories, and that inspired a whole generation of conservation and things
Mhm.
like that too. So these movies, these stories, they all help us be more empathetic to the protagonist.
Right.
So I just wanted to ask you, how do you develop a sense of empathy in your audiences when you're telling these stories?
Yeah, I think creating empathy, around difficult social issues, requires more than just presenting the facts, right? It requires,
Mhm.
that human connection. Just what I talked about in that story, that human connection that my
Yeah.
husband and I had, made all the difference in how we saw it. And I hopefully, made that difference in the life of that gentleman as well, too. My
Mhm.
philosophy really centers around storytelling that puts a face, to a name, and a face to an issue, in this case, when you tell things in an authentic way, and in ways that emotionally, enrich the story itself, and the experiences that people are having, you create that space for audiences to see themselves in it or someone they know, that they love, in that narrative as well
Yeah.
too. And I think that, there's just so many different ways that storytelling, as you pointed out too, and I love children's books, again, back to children too. Um, you know, and I believe, for me, you lead with vulnerability and in doing so, you show struggle and resiliency. And I'm hoping
Mhm.
in the story that we provided, that helps for audiences really to be invited in to feel that, right? And it
Yeah.
engages them in a way that helps to hopefully act, and when there's, action, there's tangible change, that can come about, and it's opening up hearts and minds. Storytelling is just so powerful. It's a way to create engagement for people, not to just
Mhm.
see something and observe it, but to really be involved in it.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know that you're, deeply embedded in this work, but for people who are listening to this and people who are working within corporations, what are some small changes that you hope that, taking away from this film, and just taking away from a lot of the social justice work that you've been doing, they're able to kind of integrate some of these principles into their own daily lives?
Yeah, well, in the business sense, today is such a just a fast-paced business culture, right? And oftentimes I think empathy is overlooked, um, in the drive for efficiency, right, and profit, and but empathy can really be a competitive advantage, right? When
Absolutely.
you bring that in and you lead with more compassion, and individuals, you know, start by, actively listening, and truly hearing people's stories and their challenges, and creating
Mhm.
an environment, like that, that we can professionally and personally bring that together, and look at people's perspectives, without judgment.
Mhm.
Organizations model all kinds of cultures, but creating the right kind of culture, that rewards empathy, I think is so
Mhm.
important, right? Um,
Yeah.
it just you're building, an environment that allows for trust, and vulnerability. And when you do that, people are empathetic of all people's situations, and then you grow together, tightly as a team in that way, with that kind of
Yeah.
trust and compassion, around the mission at hand, the cause, your product, but your customers, um, and compassion just isn't just, I don't know, good for morale. It really drives, loyalty, connection, impact,
Yeah.
and I think when a culture acts and behaves in that way, they can be so much more successful.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, even the research in my book, I've seen the exact same thing. When people have a real mission to show up for, they're not just fighting for their job or their work or putting food on the table. They're fighting for something that's existential. And that really brings them to the job in a way that they wouldn't have come to the job before. So it really
Right.
is fantastic for businesses to be thinking about, how can I integrate this with my operations? There's actually so much wonderful overlap that can happen between these two,
Right.
which I mean to ask you about some of the businesses that might be, helping out in this crisis. I know there's a lot of great businesses that are supporting, homelessness and things like that. But from your experience in this work, have there been any particular businesses that have been doing really great work that you would, like to feature, or kind of can be an inspiration to other businesses who might be thinking about going down that path?
Yeah. And are you relating to businesses that combat homelessness? I'm assuming, right?
Yes,
Yeah,
absolutely.
I'll showcase my husband's, I won't be
Yeah.
bashful about it because it really is an incredible organization. It's called the Gathering Inn, and it operates up in the Placer County area for all of Placer County, many parts of Sacramento, Elk Grove. So up here in Northern California, it's a large organization with 11 different programs, that span from shelters to respite care to housing. And it's just I love the way they function because it's open minded to every individual at every point that they're at. They can
Mhm.
come in if they are clean and sober and start in one program. If they're not and they're struggling with addiction, another program. If it's just simply housing because of economic reasons, there's other programs. My husband always
Yeah.
says, if you were to go to a heart doctor because you have a heart condition, you're going to be, your treatment plan is going to be so different than someone else's treatment plan, right? Because everybody's
Mhm.
different. Everybody walks through the gathering in store in a different place and time, and,
Mm.
I think what I love about them is that success just, isn't measured in numbers. It's really measured by the lives that are changed. And I've
Mm.
heard, so much of their culture and their attitude is about that. Certainly outcomes and numbers that need to be submitted for contracts to states and counties is important, right?
Yeah.
But the overall model I think that they've built is, a financially responsible model that
Mhm.
encompasses what I call the two C's, compassion and competency, right? So as a nonprofit, you are a business and you have to function as a business or you do disservice to your mission. And I really
Mhm.
see the way they carry out those two C's of making sure they're financially and fiscally responsible, but never at the cost, of their own mission and what they're set out to do. It's just an incredible team of people that care about they call them their guests. Which I love, every individual that's experiencing homelessness walks in and they are guests from our community and they're our neighbors.
Mhm.
And there's a culture that's, really rooted in dignity and in
Mhm.
accountability and so much compassion, back to that point, which really just
Mhm.
becomes a foundation for everything that they do, and everything they journey into, and it's back to that, strong culture that really drives performance.
Mhm.
I think for them, it allows, them to attract great talent, and it ensures really that the work that they're doing is sustainable, right?
Yeah.
That both, financially and socially, and it's not a trade-off. It's a formula that works. And
Yeah.
they're changing lives, one life at a time, right? You can't boil the whole ocean, you always start small and keep building. And after that incident that we had, or I should say incident, that experience, that we had on Watt Avenue with that gentleman, it was just, an interesting journey that he
Mhm.
was led into the gathering in, and the organization was a small $1 million organization, and now it's a $16 million organization serving
Wow.
thousands of individuals per year. And I think it's so much rooted in the culture, and how
Mhm.
they approach, their guests, their people, their team, everything. And with that, then the numbers come, right? The outcomes then are there. But it is that
Mhm.
focus on we're not a statistic, we
Mhm.
we are there to change lives. And I would say, the Gathering Inn is not the only organization, obviously, that we saw. One of the things that we did on this journey is that we ensured that we partnered with nonprofits across the country in multiple different
Mhm.
ways because we found that they really were the forefront of everything that was needed as far as organizations that provide wraparound services for individuals so that it's a
Yeah.
holistic approach for them. And so we've partnered with about 1,500 nonprofits across the country and our mission actually, and we've pledged to give back 50% of the net profits from all of our productions that we've
Wow.
now journeyed into to go back to organizations like The Gathering Inn that are just doing phenomenal work across the country.
Absolutely. Wow. Well, I love, that point that you made of really kind of, I think, coming authentically to each and every one of these stories. Because when you come authentically to the experience that you mentioned on Watt Avenue as well, too, that's again, like you mentioned, is where you see the numbers and you start to see scale because you're really serving a need. And whether you're a nonprofit or a business, you have to deeply think about the needs of individuals in your community and your stakeholders to truly be successful.
Yeah.
And one of the things that I think is a key piece of this is also listening and listening to your stakeholders. And I think this is a key part for businesses as well too, is truly deeply empathizing, but also really clearly listening to the customers that you're serving, to the people in your community as well too. I know that, for example, for your film, you talked with, I think it was over 175 individuals who are either working within this crisis or were, victims of this crisis in many ways to really shape how you told the story. So it truly came from a place of authenticity, which I really love. And even some businesses that I've seen in a lot of this impact work, they've come to this through listening about to people who really have their needs, and then serving those needs is what kind of changed the whole direction of their mission. And so I think that's really how you have a successful mission, is by truly first listening to the needs of people and then developing operations after that. So for you in your film, kind of how did you kind of go about thinking about listening? Obviously, you interviewed 175 or more individuals, which I think is fantastic, but how do you kind of maybe recommend to our audience as well too about how do you develop the skill of listening, and really having those, authentic connections and deeply understanding someone else's situation to help guide you in terms of how you run your own business and operations?
Yeah, incredible journey, right? That we've had, which became a documentary, Americans with No Address,
Mhm.
and it really began with the dedication that we wanted to research and truly understand what we call this American crisis, in order to make sure that our movie was authentic. The movie No Address is a fictional movie with Billy Baldwin and Beverly D'Angelo, Ashanti, Xander Berkeley, all these amazing actors. And but we wanted to make sure that it truly came across as an authentic,
Mm,
based on true stories, which it was. And so in journeying
mm,
across the country for, gosh, 3 weeks, 18, major cities, 20 states, and interviewing, like you said, over 175 people, both with lived experiences, experts, CEOs of
mhm,
organizations nationally and locally. It was really a full gamut to truly understand this.
mhm,
Again, became a documentary because it was just so powerful, and it's so
mhm,
impacting from everything that we saw and we heard. I think as it relates to those experiencing homelessness, I think that was the most impactful for so many of us, and not
mm,
realizing, as the title of our movie is No Address, what it is to really have no address, because we don't think about it in those terms. And as we began to have these incredible conversations with individuals, we learned, the logistics of not having an address. You can't
mm.
collect mail. You can't apply for a job. You can't
Yeah.
apply for school. You can't get a driver's license. You can't
Mhm,
get your health care card. I mean, there's so many things logistically you can't do without having a physical address. But as we
mhm,
ventured into more conversations, then we listened, as you're saying, listened deeply to really what came from that. You don't have a door to walk into. You don't have a key to turn.
mm,
Therefore, you don't have neighbors. Therefore, you don't have a community. Therefore,
mm,
you're isolated, right? And that's what we began to hear, was people experiencing this sense of isolation, this
mm,
sense of being invisible, not seen, not heard. And for
mm,
us, it was putting the voice to the voiceless. It was taking their stories, their untold stories, as I call them, and putting a voice to it. I remember I was walking down the street one time, as we were going through this journey, and I began to learn how, in some situations, yes, it may not be safe to engage with someone, but many times it is safe, and it makes all the difference. And I approached a gentleman and I said, "Sir, what is your name?" And he looked at me like I had asked, the most difficult mathematical question there was. And I said, "I'm sorry, sir. I just wanted to know your name. I wanted to pray for you today. I was just thinking about you as I walked by you a second time here on the street." And he looked at me and he said, "Oh my gosh, I'm so sorry. I'm just so shocked and surprised because I cannot remember the last time somebody asked me my name." And I thought,
Mm.
"Oh, that's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
That's just not okay. We have to do better." And I walked away. That was one experience that really kind of shook me. Again, I've been in
Mm.
this space now with my husband and his organization and volunteering and in making this film. But as we journeyed through this and had conversations with people and really listened in to their stories, it deepened our connection. It deepened, the way that we wanted to portray the movie and to take each story
Mhm.
that we learned along this journey and ensure that
Yeah.
it created the authenticity and the connection to the audience so that you could identify with one of these five characters, in the
Mm.
movie, a businessman who is successful, couple of bad deals, a couple misdirections, maybe a COVID type situation, and all of a
Mm.
sudden things start to spiral. And then we begin to, in this case, gamble to try and save our home and our family, right? We've heard those stories
Yeah.
before. A young boy who escapes domestic violence, and the only place for him to go is on the streets. That
Mm.
happens all the time, with
Yeah.
women and children and such. Veterans, go off to save our country and come back and oftentimes don't have the right resources that they should have. Find themselves in situations where PTSD is a situation that's one of our characters and the struggles of that. The pain that you begin to numb on the streets with addiction, and then mental health, the number one gateway into homelessness as one of our characters as well. And we see this so much, in youth these days, of all ages. We're seeing the increase of youth on our streets. And a lot of that spirals from, a simple depression where there's not the help and the healthcare there, whatever that looks like, the support system, and spirals into this. So we listen deeply and learn from so much of what
Mm.
those who experience this, those that are the experts out in the field, those that are on the front lines, those that are part of the outreach, that journey through that. And it just created just an incredible perspective for us that we could come back, I think, and create the tools to continue to speak to audiences. One of those other tools that we came back is we created a study guide after we listened and listened deeply to organizations, faith-based, secular churches. One of the things we learned is 65% of the organizations out there that are addressing homelessness are faith-based. So that drove us to create a different product of a faith-based study guide that churches could use in their homeless ministries. And
Mm.
because we listened, back to your point,
Yeah.
you listen and it became, gosh, this isn't just about a film. We need to do a
Mhm.
documentary so people hear these untold stories. We need to do a study guide so that it helps another audience, the church audience. We need to do a novel so people could read more deeply into these characters and understand the backstory of how this could happen to anyone. And we need to have a
Mhm.
soundtrack because the power of music reaches
Yeah.
audiences. So we call it the Big Five, and it allowed us to create the No Address movement so that
Mm.
audiences, from all over, could, experience this in a different way in the hopes of, changing the minds of others. And I think, as you say, go back to businesses, a true leader is all about listening, right? We
Yeah.
need to listen to the things that we're hearing, and we also need to listen to the things we're not hearing, because it's in
Mm.
those moments that we're inspired to do the right things for our teams, our people, our customers, our guests, whatever that looks like. But we have to listen deeply, listen without
Mhm.
agendas, just lean
Yeah.
in.
Absolutely. And it's such a fantastic point of listening to those around us, but then also listening to the things that are unspoken, because that's sometimes where the deepest inequalities lie, is what we're not hearing. So I love that. And obviously, you've been able to tell such beautiful stories and be so impactful through that. As we're kind of wrapping up this conversation, I would just love to ask you, what can our audience do in terms of their first step in terms of whether they're working in a corporation and they want to lead with a bit more empathy, or maybe they're running an organization and they're an entrepreneur, and they want to, maybe shift their mission towards doing something that they believe is more impactful. What would you recommend to them as kind of their first initial step?
Well, I'll start with companies first, then go to individuals. I think companies just have such a powerful role sometimes that they often don't realize, right? That
Yeah.
they can play in solving issues like homelessness. It, goes beyond writing a check to an organization. It really starts by using their platforms, their
Mhm.
influence, that helps to drive change, as a company, but also as people. Um, I see so many companies, as we journeyed with these nonprofits, the companies that are involved and connected to them, really are part of that meaningful change. When they partner with local nonprofits, as we saw, one of the organizations I noticed had 20% of the people in their shelters were working full time. I think that was an aha moment for all of
Wow.
us. And we began to find that in many shelters, they just did not have enough money saved to be able to get their own apartment. And Home
Mm.
Depot was a partner in this case, and
Wow.
many of the individuals that were in the shelters worked for Home Depot. And, it was just an
Mm.
incredible job training, second chance type of employment for these people. And I just love to see that, that partnership, providing services and products also to the organization and in kind, that they did. But then really being an advocate for policy change, by doing that and being involved in so many ways. So, I think it goes back to that culture, how important it is, to create empathy and awareness. And when you do that, it drives the people in your organization to do more. There is that statistic, which I won't pretend to know exactly what it is, but we all know that this new generation that's entering into the workforce and has for the last 10 years is really about working for organizations that give back, that
Mm.
volunteer.
Absolutely.
There's so many organizations that's part of their benefits that they give 8 hours of volunteer for their employees. And I think as companies begin to react to what it is that this growing workforce is wanting and needing, it's important for them to embed that, into their companies, the opportunities to volunteer, to give back. As I worked at Make-A-Wish, it was just an incredible opportunity to work with so many companies, that did that. And it was embedded in their culture, and they were so involved in it intimately being a part of every wish that they sponsored. And I love that. I love seeing companies do that as individuals. It's important for us, to do that on our own. Whether our company offers it or not, because I think when we walk into that space, we're changed. I think sometimes when we volunteer, we think that we're volunteering to help change someone else's lives, but the
Mm.
experience can be so profound. I'll give even the example of our cast who made the commitment when they came to Sacramento to film the movie. They wanted to walk through the encampments. They wanted to experience, what they in their character would be like. And I think at first they thought they were just getting in character, and studying, the character. But they would tell you today they had a profound experience by doing so, taking that
Mm.
journey, interacting with people, creating that connection and understanding of where they were, where they are today, and where they hope to be, in the future. And from that point to every one of our main characters, from Billy Baldwin to Ty Pennington to Ashanti, they are huge advocates in this space now. And I think it has forever changed them. And it goes for all of us just as individuals. I always say, people think, oh, this issue in our country, 2.8 million individuals are homeless. And of that 1.5 million are children, which is just astounding, right? It feels so huge and overwhelming and hopeless. And I always say from our journey in this project, it's not hopeless. It's very hopeful. There are organizations and companies doing some phenomenal work and communities that are
Mhm.
supporting that. And so, when people say, what do I do? How can I help? I say volunteer, which is just the simple word of like, okay, what does that mean? I'm going to go pass out food. But no, when
Mhm.
you walk into a shelter and you sit down and you have a conversation for 1 hour with a person or a number of people, I guarantee you it will profoundly change you and your perspective and the way that you look at the world and the way that you look at your neighbors and people. And so I encourage people to do that. If you don't have the time to do that and you have the resources to give back, I always say I go back to like me doing the wrong thing. You don't hand out money out your window. You don't hand out food because that's enabling instead of engaging. So if you can
Mhm.
financially support, give to organizations that are doing that. That is their
Yeah.
24/7 job is to help individuals. And so your money is going to a better place by making donations that way. If you can't do either one of those, I always say the easiest thing you can do is engage with somebody as you walk by them on the street. Look them in the eye,
Mhm.
say hello, have a kind word, even if it's just have a great day. Because so often our journey through this is people say, it was just that. There was a moment that someone cared about me. There was a moment I was seen. There was a moment that I had a voice because somebody asked me a question. And it just changed my life. You know, it won't do it all the time, right? It's baby steps.
Right.
But we can change, the lives of people one day at a time, and we never know that that conversation or that hello might do that. And that's something we can all do. So that's the simple piece.
Well, that certainly shines through in the film. And I think it's so beautiful what you mentioned that, we show up to thinking we're going to give to someone else, but really it changes us. And even as business leaders, when we have those experiences, it may not completely change our business, but it changes our philosophy and how we run the business as well, too. If we can have those experiences and go out and have that as a guiding philosophy, we almost create an impactful business, whether we realize it or not, when our philosophy ourselves as leaders has been changed like that. And you mentioned that young people are certainly more engaged when their businesses do this. And you're right. I mean, Junior Achievement, which works with, youth all over the world, 70% of the businesses that they're starting under the age of 25 are related to sustainability or social impact, which
Mhm.
certainly can speak volumes in terms of how do you engage the next generation into the workforce, is certainly by connecting to a lot of these issues as well, too.
Yeah.
Well, I feel so inspired after this conversation. I'm certain that everyone who's listened to this will want to go out and see your movie if they haven't already. But how can we support you and find you online and support the great work that you do?
Yeah, so it's noaddressmovie.com. You can go there and find out about all of our products, but certainly No Address, that was nationally theatrically released months ago, has now left theaters. And so it's streaming on many platforms. So if you go to noaddressmovie.com, you can see all the platforms that it's streaming on. Started last Friday, and it's on all your major cable networks on demand as well too. And then also at the site, you can find out how to look at our other products, which the Americans with No Address documentary is super inspiring and just interesting and different. That's available on Amazon. Our study guide and our novels available on Amazon. But again, it's for us to be able to give back. It's important for your audience to know that every time you make a purchase of any one of our products, 50% goes back to these nonprofits that we just discussed. And I love that, about the culture, what we've created and the mission that we've done, to create that empathy and compassion for audiences that engage, with everything that we're doing. So go to noaddressmovie.com.
Well, wonderful. Thank you so much. And thank you so much for attending this episode of Sustainability Experts.
Thanks, Vanessa.
I wanted to share three takeaways that I took away from the conversation with Jennifer. The first is that empathy is a catalyst for impact. Jennifer's stories have inspired millions through understanding homelessness and humanizing the crisis. When you create stories, it creates empathy, which can help people take action towards a lot of these issues. The second is that small steps create big change. She mentioned some great stories about simply going up to someone on the street and just asking their name and saying hello. Simply making someone feel at home and not isolated can change their lives profoundly. And the last is that doing good and doing well can go hand in hand. We mentioned numerous businesses in our conversation that are both doing well and also doing good. A lot of times, engaging your employees with a great, impactful cause can actually help them fight for your business in a way that they wouldn't show up otherwise. Again, thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Experts. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Sustainability Experts. If you liked the insights from our podcast, feel free to reach out to us on our website. We produce episodes with world-class executives every month and offer exclusive consulting and speaking services globally. Reach out to us and become a leader in your industry.